Hello dolls, and welcome back to another video. Today I would like to take a deep dive into the history of an album that is one of my personal favorite, The Velvet Underground and Nico. I personally adore the music and the whole history behind it, and it's just such a wild record, a record that failed to make pretty much any impact, but has become such an important piece of rock and roll history. As musician Brian Eno once said, the album only sold 10,000 copies, but everyone who bought one of those 10,000 copies started a band. So today, let me take you back to the days of the Velvet Underground and Nico. I have two books about these topics that I always like to recommend, that I adored reading. However, these are more focused on Nico, and like her time with the Velvet Underground obviously plays into it, but it's more focused on her life. There is this one, Nico, Die Sängerin der Nacht. It's a German book. It's a novel, but it is very close to reality. I read this one after my stepdad gave it to me. It's a phenomenal read. And then I wanted to know what about it was actually true, and so I got this one, which I always say is one of the best biographies I've ever read. Nico was a very complicated person. I'm gonna talk about her in this video, but not on the deep level that this book does, or the podcast episode that I wrote about her, so I'm just gonna link that here. But this is You Are Beautiful and You Are Alone, the biography of Nico by Jennifer Otter Bickerdijk, and this book is just so phenomenal. So I'm also taking inserts from this, because I think it is safe to say there was a reason why they only ever made one record in their original constellation. But now, without any more talking, let me take you back to the underground world of New York. Welcome to the Velvet Underground, from the factory to forever. In 1967, record shoppers might have encountered a curious LP cover, a simple yellow banana on a plain white background, accompanied by the words, "Peel slowly and see." Behind that playful image lay some of the most daring music of its time, songs about urban vice and alienation set to droning viola, pounding drums and squalling guitars. This was The Velvet Underground and Nico, the audacious debut album of an unknown New York band championed by pop artist Andy Warhol. In an era of flower power anthems and sunny psychedelic rock, The Velvet Underground's music plunged into the gritty underside of city life. Not surprisingly, the album shocked many critics and sold poorly upon release. Yet, in the decades that followed, The Velvet Underground and Nico came to be recognized as a cornerstone of modern music. Its initial commercial failure belied a profound artistic influence that would only reveal itself over time. As musician Brian Eno famously quipped, the album only sold 10,000 copies, but everyone who bought one of those 10,000 copies started a band. The story of the Velvet Underground and Nico was one of art over acceptance, how a band born in Warhol's downtown factory created an art rock classic that, despite being overlooked in its day, lit a slow-burning fuse that ultimately changed rock and roll forever. Chapter 1: New York Underground. A cold New York City winter in 1965. In a dingy loft on Ludlow Street, a young Welsh musician scraped a lone, droning note on his viola while an American poet strummed an oddly tuned guitar. John Cale, the classically trained avant-gardist from Wales, and Lou Reed, the streetwise songwriter from Long Island, had just met, and the chemistry was electric. They bonded over a vision of music that would fuse raw rock and roll with the experimental drones of the avant-garde. Lou was spending his days writing bubblegum pop songs for a budget record label, but had closets full of darker, more literary material the label wouldn't let him release. John was intrigued when Lou played him these forbidden songs on his acoustic guitar. Gritty tales titled Heroin and Venus in Furs, quote, "These are rock songs," John insisted, hearing orchestras of noise hidden in Lou's rudimental strumming. Quote, "These can be really big and orchestral. Let's just do it ourselves," he urged. and in that moment they decided to form a band of their own. They recruited Sterling Morrison, Lou's college friend from Syracuse University, on guitar. For drums, they enlisted Maureen Tucker, the teenage sister of one of Morrison's friends, who had played rhythms on a makeshift kid in her childhood bedroom. Mo's style was raw and stripped down. She stood at the drums, mallets in hand, pounding tom-toms and bass drum. Her minimal approach drew on trance-like rhythms and instinctive simplicity, creating the ominous pulse that undermined the Velvet sound. The four newcomers dubbed themselves the Velvet Underground, taking the name from a dog-eared paperback about secret sexual subcultures, a fitting emblem for the transgressive art they aimed to create. From the outset, the Velvet Underground was an affront to the musical status quo. As the folk rock boom and the sunny summer of love approached, Reed and John Cale reveled in urban shadows. In grungy downtown clubs, they unleashed feedback squalls and taboo lyrics upon unsuspecting audiences. At their very first gig, a high school auditorium in suburban New Jersey, they played I'm Waiting for the Man, Heroin, and Venus in Furs to a stunned crowd of teenagers expecting jangly dance music. 15 minutes of drowning amplifiers and whiplash rhythms left the kids gaping in silence. The Velvet Underground had made their underground debut. Mo recalled that in each song, something of mine broke. A bass drum pedal, a cymbal stand there, as if the very equipment was unprepared for the onslaught. Quote, all my stuff was falling apart, she laughed about that nerve-wracking night. The audience didn't know what hit them, but Lou Reed did. In his dark sunglasses and black outfit, Lou exuded a blunt, confrontational cool. He had studied the works of writers like William S. Burroughs and Hubert Selby Jr., gritty chroniclers of society's underbelly, and he saw no reason rock music couldn't do the same. Quote, that's the kind of stuff you might read, Lou said of the lurid literary topics he put into songs. Why wouldn't you listen to it? You get the fun of reading that, and you get the fun of rock on top of it. To Lou, singing about shooting up drugs or whips and chains was as natural as writing a love song, just more honest, more real. Night after night in 1966, the Velvet Underground played grimy clubs in the East Village, refining their identity. They turned up at Café Bazaar in Greenwich Village and assaulted beatnik patrons with shattering volumes and subversive lyrics. Words began to spread through the underground art scene about this new and strange band. They were described as, quote, a full-fledged attack on the ears and on the brain, with dark poetic sounds that peeled back the polite veneer of pop music. In the audience one night was an experimental filmmaker by the name of Barbara Rubin, who was so impressed and perhaps amused that she urged her mentor, a certain silver-haired pop art icon, to come and see the spectacle. A few evenings later, Andy Warhol strolled into the club, just in time to watch the Velvets get themselves fired. The club owner had begged them not to play their dissonant anti-song, The Black Angel's Death Song, but Reed and Cale launched into an even more raucous number out of pure defiance. The manager promptly booted them off the stage. It was Christmas of 1965, and the Velvet Underground once again had no steady gig, but now they had Andy Warhol's attention. Warhol, already famous for turning soup cans into high art, had been searching for a rock band to complete his vision of a multimedia happening, and he found that missing piece in the Velvet's music. Quote, Andy liked us immediately, Mo recalled. He had this idea for a multimedia show and asked if we wanted to do it. The band, hungry for any break, eagerly agreed. Warhol christened the traveling performance the exploding plastic inevitable, a cacophony of flashing film projectors, strobe lights, dancers cracking whips on stage, and the Velvet Underground churning out a throbbing sound at the center of it all. In early 1966, Warhol's silver-painted factory studio became the band's new home. Mo, shy and barely out of high school, was in awe of the glamorous misfits who populated Warhol's world. I'd come into the city every weekend to hang out at the factory, she said. It was just great, all sorts of interesting people. I was totally naive. I had never been anywhere or done anything, and here I was sitting in the factory with Andy Warhol. Warhol's superstars, drug addicts, drag queens, socialites like Edie Sedgwick swirled around the Velvets, inspiring songs and challenging the band's notions of art. The factory scene was outrageous and indulgent, but Warhol himself treated the musicians kindly. He made the introverted Mo feel very welcome, never talking down to her, even letting her playfully chase him around the studio on Sundays, demanding gas money for her drive home. In Andy, the Velvets found a patron saint of misfits, someone with the fame and resources to shield them from the commercial music industry's pressures. Quote, "He just made it possible for us to be ourselves," Lou Reed later said of Warhol. Andy hardly knew anything about producing records, but he didn't need to. Quote, "He was this umbrella that absorbed all the attacks when we weren't large enough to be attacked. We'd just walk in and do what we always did, and no one would stop it, because Andy was the producer," Lou explained. If the straight world derided their music as sick or garbage, Warhol's mere presence deflected the criticism. The band could continue unmolested in their artistic daring. Warhol's only mandate was to be true to themselves, push boundaries, and perhaps put little swear words in now and then. In other words, he told them, don't sanitize anything, and the Velvets obliged with gusto. By mid-1966, the Velvet Underground was the toast of New York City's art subculture and the bane of conventional sensibilities. Their music was called, quote, "the Ide of the Summer of Love," peeling back the era's flower children's utopianism to show the bugs crawling underneath. Where the West Coast bands sang about peace and love, the Velvet sang of shooting heroin in a Harlem stairwell and of sadomasochistic sex in decadent uptown lofts. One San Francisco critic sneered the Velvet show was, quote, "very Greenwich Village sick," a crude joke unworthy of true art. But Warhol and his circle knew better. This was art, new and radical. And in the factory's restless search for new icons, there was one figure waiting at the edges of Warhol's world who would soon be drawn into the orbit of the Velvet Underground. Nico had already drifted through several worlds before she entered Andy Warhol's circle. Born Christa Päffgen in Germany, she had modeled in Paris, acted in Fellini's La Dolce Vita, and recorded a solo single produced by Rolling Stones manager Andrew Luke Oldham. By the mid-60s, she had made her way to New York, moving through the same bohemian currents as Bob Dylan, Brian Jones, and Leonard Cohen. She was introduced to Warhol through Paul Morrissey, one of Andy's closest collaborators at the factory. Nico became part of Warhol's circle almost immediately, statuesque, enigmatic, and with a voice unlike anyone else's. Warhol saw in her not just a model or a muse, but an instrument. As he later said, quote, "I thought the band should have a girl singer, someone beautiful to balance their sound. It was through this factory connection that Nico was paired with the Velvet Underground." Warhol, now acting as their manager and protector, had the power to shape their image as much as their sound. When he insisted on bringing Nico in, the Velvets and especially Lou bristled. To them it felt like an intrusion on the fragile chemistry, but with Andy's name opening doors no one else could, they had little choice but to bend to his vision. At Warhol's urging, Lou grudgingly penned a song for Nico to perform, a gentle tease of an Edie Sedgwick-type socialite titled Femme Fatale. Nico's presence was controversial within the band. Lou Reed hated sharing the microphone. Quote, "I was the singer of the band," he'd later grumble. But he swallowed his pride, recognizing that Nico's marquee value could broaden their appeal. And he also realized that there was simply no way Andy would let them continue without her. What Warhol wanted, he always got. Dressed in mauve all white against the band's all black, the flaxen-haired Nico stood out on stage, swaying enigmatically as she intoned Lou's somber pop songs. Visually and sonically, she appeared almost innocent and delicate against the Velvet's gritty backdrop. It was an odd match that somehow worked. Nico's cool monotone on songs like All Tomorrow's Parties added a new dimension to the group's sound, a haunting, detached lament that Warhol adored. All Tomorrow's Parties became Warhol's favorite Velvet Underground song, an anthem for his factory scene with its lyrics about tattered dresses and desperate riches. As the band ground out its hypnotic death march of a groove, reinforced by John Cale's drowning organ and most ritualistic beat, Nico's voice hovered like a ghost over the cacophony. In that uneasy balance between beauty and noise, Andy Warhol found his art in their music. Chapter 2. Peel Slowly and See. In April of 1966, flush with Warhol's patronage, the Velvet Undergrounds decamped to a ramshackle studio in Midtown Manhattan to record their first album. They had no record deal at this point. Warhol and the band's manager, Paul Morrissey, financed the sessions out of pocket. The studio, Skeptor Records warehouse, was hardly state-of-the-art. The walls were lined with discarded mattresses to dampen the sound. Over mere hours, reportedly just about one long day's work, the Velvets captured on tape the raw essence of their life set. Warhol was credited as the producer, although his role was more cheerleader and atmosphere provider than a knob twiddler. Quote, "Of course he didn't know anything about record production, but he simply didn't have to," Lou Reed noted wryly. Andy simply let the tapes roll, interjecting occasionally with an encouraging, "Ooh, that's fantastic," which to the band was all the approval they really needed. No one from any record label was around to censor the shocking songs or tame the feedback. The group was free to, quote, "do what we always did, and no one would stop us because Andy was the producer." The result was an album like none other in 1966, a collection of sophisticated folk rock tunes, drenched in amplifier fuzz, avant-garde minimalism, and streetwise lyricism. Warhol even created the album's striking cover, a simple yellow banana on a white background, with the teasing caption, "Peel slowly and see." Early copies of the LP invited the owner to literally peel off a banana skin sticker to reveal a flesh-colored fruit underneath, a sly visual metaphor for the music itself, which would reveal new layers of meaning and shock with each listen. With Tom Wilson, a seasoned producer fresh of sessions with Bob Dylan and Frank Zappa, brought in by MGM and Verve Records to assist, additional according continued into the summer. One late night, Lou Reed realized the album still lacked an obvious opening track. In the pre-dawn hours, he and John Cale rushed to a friend's apartment and spotted a strange little pump organ, a harmonium, in the corner. Immediately, inspiration struck. Lou perched with his guitar while John pumped the wheezing harmonium, and off we went riding Sunday morning, John recalled. The song that emerged was deceptively pretty. Lou crooned in a gentle, lilting voice over a chiming celesta and melodic bass line, evoking the delicate haze of an early morning. But beneath the lullaby sweetness lay paranoia. Lou's lyrics pleaded, "Watch out, the world's behind you," hitting at the creeping anxieties of a drug come-down or the emptiness that followed a wild Saturday night. Sunday Morning eventually led off the album, its dreamy veneer alluring listeners into the darker depths to follow. Tellingly, Lou had originally written it for Nico to sing, aiming for her frosty chanteuse touch, but in the studio, he kept the lead vocal for himself, imparting a boyish vulnerability tinged with doubt. Nico instead lent ethereal backing vocals, like a ghost in the background of Lou's mind. Thus, the record opened with a subtle sleight of hand, a bright melody with uneasy shadows, the calm before the storm. From that gentle start, the album drove headlong into New York's underground. I'm Waiting for the Man chucked in on a jackhammer piano riff and shambling guitar chords as Lou drawled the story of a white kid trekking into Harlem to score heroin from his dealer. The $26 man up on Lexington and 125th. Lou's voice was matter-of-fact, almost deadpan, as he narrated his street odyssey. Up to Lexington, 125, feeling sick and dirty, more dead than alive. It was a report from the underbelly of the city, set to a gritty, shaming rock groove. In the background, John hammered a percussive barrelhouse-style piano to mimic the bustling energy of the streets. Few listeners in 1967 had heard anything like I'm Waiting for the Man, a song about a drug addict's daily routine told without any judgment. Lou didn't care if it shocked, This was life on the sidewalks, and the Velvets were determined to put reality, however unseemly, into rock. Quote, "We said, we're not playing top 10 hits, we've got our own numbers," John recalled. Until Andy arrived, they struggled to get gigs, but his notoriety and contacts opened doors and let them finally preserve their set list on vinyl. Midway through side 1 came Venus in Furs, Lou's ode to Sacha Masoch's 19th century novel, openly about BDSM in a time no label would touch it. Over Moe's tom-tom pulls and John's screeching electric viola, like an airplane engine, he said, Lou intoned, "Taste the width and love not given lightly." It was a distillation of the band's aesthetic, beauty and noise, old world art and street grit. Critics like Robert Christgau later hailed its narcotic drone as central to the Velvet sound. Nico's showcases revealed another side of Lou's writing. Femme Fatale, inspired by Edie Sedgwick, came at Warhol's suggestion, its cool detachment perfectly suited to Nico's accented monotone. On I'll Be Your Mirror, Lou wrote with tenderness, offering Nico reassurance in a song she delivered with rare vulnerability, backed by Sterling's chiming guitar and Moe's tambourine. These tracks showed the Velvet's capacity for beauty amid their confrontation. The album's centerpiece was Heroin, a 7-minute journey through an addict's psyche. It shifted from quiet strumming to violent crescendos as Moe's drumming accelerated and John's viola screamed, mirroring the drug's rush and crash. Lou always insisted it was neither for nor against heroin, but simply a truthful depiction. It wasn't pro or con, it was just talking about it. Sterling called it, quote, "possibly Reed's greatest and a truthful one." Moe, who never even touched drugs, said audiences mistook it for confession rather than theater, but the song remained one of rock's rawest artistic statements. Side 2 continued that spirit. Run, Run, Run was their ragged party song, while the Black Angel's Death song showcased Lou Reed's surreal poetry over John Cale's droning viola, baffling to most but thrilling in its energy. The closer European Sun exploded after one brief tribute to Lou's mentor, Delmore Schwartz, smashing into pure improvisation. On stage, it could stretch over half an hour. On record, it ended in a storm of feedback and shattered glass. Quote, "We were never thinking of top 40 success," John laughed. "We just wanted to see how far music could go." By the album's end, the listener traveled from the fragile calm of Sunday morning into the maelstrom of European Sun, a journey through innocence and experience that redefined what rock music could contain. It was always different whenever they performed it, and it quickly became their favorite song to play. This must have been so wonderful. Imagine going and seeing the Velvets play a couple of times, and whenever European Sun comes on, it's just completely different. John Cale even said that they never played it the same way twice because there was no way to actually play it. There was a beginning and then everyone just did their thing. And you have to understand that during the time, 1966, this was when the Beatles were on the height of their fame. This was very much when a lot of bands were still largely controlled by labels. A lot of it was bubblegum pop. Think the Beach Boys. It was before everything took that psychedelic turn, before bands and topics got deeper and more different. So listening to the Velvet Underground must have felt like an entirely different universe to people back then. No wonder no one really liked it at first. Yet, when the album was finally released in March of 1967, after months of delay, the world scarcely knew what to make out of it. The delay itself was emblematic. After recording, the Velvet struggled to find a label brave enough to put it out, and even once Verve Records were on board, there were still complications. Early copies had been recalled because the back cover photo, a fleeting image from one of Andy Warhol's films, inadvertently featured an actor's face, and he decided to threaten to sue. The famous banana cover also required a special and quite costly printing process for the peel-off sticker, which held up manufacturing. By the time The Velvet Underground and Nico hit stores, it was mid-1967. The summer of love was blooming with flower power anthems like San Francisco and the Beatles' Sgt. Pepper. In contrast, the Velvet's EP looked and sounded like a missive from another planet, one painted in monochrome rather than psychedelic technicolor. Chapter 3: The Shock of the New. The album landed with a bang and a whimper. On release, The Velvet Underground and Nico sold poorly, to put it mildly. Estimates vary, but only around 30,000 copies were sold in the first 5 years. In 1967, those numbers were a commercial disaster. By comparison, the Beatles sold hundreds of thousands of Sgt. Pepper albums every single week. Part of the problem was visibility. Verve, a jazz label dabbling in rock, seemed uncertain on how to market this strange banana-clad record. They did not push it heavily, and distribution was spotty at best. Quote, "Our record company never paid royalties and they never distributed us," Mo later lamented. "We'd go play somewhere, people would pack the place and then say, 'We can't find your record.' Everywhere we went, same old thing." The Velvets would win converts in live performances, but fans literally couldn't buy the album afterwards. "I don't know why Verve signed us," Mo mused bitterly. "To keep us off the streets?" At times, it felt like the Swedes simply wanted to bury the band's unruly noise. Critically, initial reactions were polarized. A few perceptive reviewers recognized the album's stark brilliance right away. Billboard magazine gave a brief but positive notice, praising Nico's haunting vocals and the powerful lyrics, calling the record a left fielder which could click in a big way. In other words, it was far outside the mainstream, but had the substance to make an impact if given the chance. A young Richard Goldstein, writing in The Village Voice, was intrigued, though somewhat perpetrated. He acknowledged, quote, "The Velvets are an important group with major work on the album." Goldstein, who had seen the band live, noted that the recorded Heroin felt more restrained than the onstage version he had witnessed, but still described its climax in evoking terms. Quote, "A series of utterly terrifying squeals, like the death rattle of a suffocating violin. 7 minutes of genuine 12-tone rock and roll." That was quite the praise for the context of 1967, comparing Lou and John's noisy improvisations to avant-garde classical music. Many other critics, however, simply didn't get it or didn't want to. In San Francisco, home of the hippie movement, reviewers heaped scorn. One West Coast columnist dismissed the album as, quote, "several confusing sounds, most depressing," admitting that whatever message the Velvets had, I failed to get it. Another critic sneered that the music was as lifeless and inanimate as the discarded banana peel, calling the record a collection of cliches devoid of the genuine fun good rock and roll should have. Even in the Velvets' hometown of New York, some were nonplussed. Robert Christgau, who would later champion the band, admitted that in 1967 it was difficult to understand the album. The Velvets' edgy sounds and transgressive themes were so far ahead of their time that they initially left many listeners bewildered. As Christgau later put it, the record, quote, "sounds intermittently crude, thin and pretentious at first, but it never stops getting better." In short, it demanded time and an open mind, luxurious the fat-driven pop world seldom granted on first listen. And then there was the band's association with Andy Warhol, which proved to be a double-edged sword. On one hand, Warhol's name and striking cover art drew curiosity. Some bought the LP just to own the funky banana design, which one newspaper called, quote, "the wildest front cover of any album yet." On the other hand, more conservative critics wrote off the album as a mere Warholian stunt. A Tampa Tribune writer sniffed that Warhol's fans would surely declare it his best, implying that only an art-obsessed in-crowd could find merit in such noise. Quote, "Whatever the message, I failed to get it," that reviewer effectively shrugged, likely uncomfortable with the unvarnished drug and sexual content blasting from his speakers. Indeed, songs like Heroin and Venus in Furs virtually ensured the album got zero airplay on mainstream radio. Most AM stations wouldn't touch on material that dealt so frankly with drugs or deviant sex. As a result, the Velvet Underground and Nico lurked around at the very bottom of the album charts, if it appeared at all. Legend had it that at its peak, the album barely graced the Billboard Top 200s, only to vanish shortly after. The Velvet Underground had created a masterpiece, but almost no one knew it yet. Inside the band, the same turbulence that had produced the record was beginning to split it apart. Nico's presence had always been double-edged. Her glacial voice gave the album some of its most unforgettable moments. Femme Fatale, All Tomorrow's Parties, I'll Be Your Mirror, but she was never truly accepted as part of the group. Lou felt threatened by having to share the microphone. John often dismissed her musically, and Sterling admitted that they simply didn't know how to fit her into their set once the record was finished. Jennifer Otter Bickerdijk writes in You Are Beautiful and You Are Alone that Andy's sponsorship had been the glue keeping her with the band. He was the one who insisted she sing with them, and as long as his name shielded the group, she remained in place. But when Warhol's influence over the Velvets began to fade in 1967, so did Nico's position. As Moe Tucker later put it, quote, "We were the Velvet Underground with Nico for about a year. I don't think there was a point when someone said, Nico's out of the band. We just kind of drifted." That drift was partly circumstance and partly design. Nico herself longed to develop her own identity rather than remain Warhol's addition to Lou's band. After experiencing the stage as a singer, she discovered a darker, more personal sound that would come to define her solo work. By the end of 1967, she was recording Chelsea Girl and distancing herself from the Velvets, even as their legacy with them remained permanently etched in their first record. As said, I have made an entire podcast episode all about Nico. She was a very complicated person, to say the least. She grew up in wild circumstances, and I don't want to defend her because she's also done some horribly racist things, and you can always say she grew up in Nazi Germany and that was kind of like implemented in her, but I don't think that that is an excuse because this was 20 years later, and at that point you can reflect your values. And a lot of the issues that she had with Lou Reed came from the fact that he was Jewish and she was German, and that was kind of difficult for everyone. They also had an affair, it never really worked, and there was just a lot going on, and the Nico podcast episode focuses a lot more on that, but if you would like me to bring that episode over here, I've done it with a Janice episode. I've also done it with a Marian Faithful one, where I sometimes take a podcast episode and kind of like rework it into a video. Let me know. I would love to do that for you. But what I think is very important to understand here is that Andy Warhol, even though he didn't really add anything artistically, he was really important to this group because he gave them so much of his attention, and that is what really made it so easy for them to have all of these opportunities in the beginning. However, this is something I spoke about in my Edie Sedgwick video before. Andy Warhol had this tendency of loving someone and then just letting them fall a day later. So he was so obsessed with Edie. She was in all of his films, and then one day he just decided he was over it, and he turned his focus and shifted over to the Velvets, and he put all his energy into them. And then a year later he was like, well, I'm kind of over that, let's move on to the next thing. And that also largely distributed to the fact why they fell apart. However, I just want to say that in Nico's biography, it is very obvious that she never really felt like part of the Velvets. They never made her feel like a part, but it also almost feels like she didn't really want it to belong to them. It always felt like this was the Velvet Underground and Nico. It was never the Velvet Underground with Nico. Warhol's close involvement also waned, and the band sought to develop their own terms. By the summer of 1967, not long after the album finally hit stores, Lou Reed made a fateful decision. He severed the band's ties with Andy Warhol. but he resented any outside control over the Velvet's direction, and Warhol's star was beginning to eclipse the band's in the media. With the album often referred to as Andy Warhol's Velvet Underground, Lou informed Andy that the band needed new management and a new path. Quote, "It was just time for us to leave and stop fooling around and be a real band," Mo explained of the split, noting that it wasn't especially dramatic, more like a pragmatic move. Warhol did feel somewhat hurt, because usually he was the one deciding when it was time to move on from a project, and would later often say that it hurt him a lot being fired by Lou Reed. Their mentor-protege relationship effectively ended there. The Velvets moved on to create harsher, louder music. Their 1968 follow-up, White Light, White Heat, dispensed with Nico and any polished production, diving even deeper into raw noise. John Cale and Lou Reed's own creative tensions also came to a head. By late 1968, John was forced out of the band he'd helped found, as Lou sought a more conventional sound. The 4 original Velvet Underground members would never record another full album together after their debut. In the wake of the Velvet Underground and Nico's commercial failure, the band splintered and limped on through the late 1960s, with new members before quietly disbanding in 1970. The world hadn't been ready for what they offered, and the Velvets themselves paid a price. No hit records, little money, and for a time only a cult following concentrated in hip enclaves of New York, London, and a few European cities. As Mo put it, when the band was over, it was simply time to get a job in this straight world again. Lou Reed did just that for a while, working as a typist at his father's company. Sterling Morrison returned to academia and later became a tugboat captain. It seemed that the Velvet Underground and Nico might have been a beautiful, doomed one-off, a revolutionary art statement destined to gather dust in bargain bins, its creators scattered to the winds. Chapter 4: All Tomorrow's Bands. Yet that was not the end of the story. Far from it. It was only the beginning of the album's legend. In the shadows, the Velvet Underground and Nico was quietly doing its work, seeping into the culture one listener at a time. Those who did buy the album in 1967 often became zealous converts, spreading the word to friends. Copies were loaned out like prized literature. Aspiring musicians listened in rapt fascination to this odd record with a banana on the cover, marveling at how it broke every rule they thought was unbreakable. Among these listeners were people who would later become icons themselves. Brian Eno, a British musician who would go on to become a groundbreaking producer, famously quipped years later that the first Velvet Underground album only sold 10,000 copies, but everyone who bought one of these 10,000 copies started a band. Of course, he was exaggerating. The album sold a little more than that, but Eno's point entered rock folklore. The record's influence vastly outstripped its sales. Each person who fell under its spell was inspired to create something in its spirit, raw, honest, and adventurous. One of those people was a young David Bowie. In 1966, Bowie was a mod singer in London, searching for direction. When he heard the Velvet Underground and Nico, it was like a door blowing open. Quote, "It was the fringe, strange bands that nobody ever bought, like the Velvet Underground, that actually have created modern music," Bowie later observed. He argued that the Velvets were ultimately more influential than even the Beatles because they pointed the way to the future. Quote, "Tomorrow's culture is always dictated by the artists," Bowie said. While millions adored the Beatles, there were artists running around saying, "Yeah, they're okay, but have you heard of the Velvet Underground?" The artists make culture, not the critics, Bowie said. And in fact, David Bowie would become one of those evangelists spreading the gospel of the Velvets. He covered the Velvet Underground songs in his early live sets, preaching their brilliance to anyone who would listen. His own music, from the gritty rock of his 1970 album, The Man Who Sold the World, to the gender-bending glam of Ziggy Stardust, carried forward the Velvet spirit of experimentation and transgression. Bowie even produced Lou Reed's 1972 solo breakthrough, Transformer, helping Lou Reed translate the Velvet's edgy ethos into a more radio-friendly form for the new decade. The album's shock waves spread slowly but relentlessly. In New York, the Dolls, Patti Smith, Television, and the Ramones built punk on the Velvet's raw minimalism and outsider stance. Across the Atlantic, the Sex Pistols and Joy Division carried that spirit into England's punk and post-punk underground. In Germany, Kann and Neu drew on the Velvet's drones to shape the experimental sound of krautrock. By the 1980s, Susie and the Banshees and other goth icons carried forward the band's dark atmospheres, while in the 90s, indie and lo-fi acts treated the Velvet Underground and Nico as their sacred text. Wherever artists chose honesty over polish or dared to fuse poetry with noise, the Velvet's DNA was there. By the 21st century, the banana cover had become an icon, hanging on museum walls as high art and taped to dorm room walls as a symbol of rebellion. Sunday Morning floated through films and commercials, its once eerie Celesta, now a nostalgic chime. Teenagers streamed the record as if it had just been released, marveling that something conceived in 1966 could still sound like the future. The initial shock had long since worn off, but the power of the music remained intact, a testament to how far ahead of its time the Velvet Underground had been. David Bowie, who had watched them from the shadows of the 60s, later reflected, they were the true artists. It introduced a darker, urban infatuation, street culture, and amorality into popular music. What had once been scorned as non-artistic garbage was decades later enshrined in the Library of Congress as a work of enduring significance. But the real legacy was more intimate. For Lou, John, Sterling, and Mo, who had endured the silence of indifferent crowds, the jeers of critics, the discomfort of being too raw, too real, there was a strange vindication in knowing the world had finally caught up. For Nico, whose voice had once been derided as glacial and alien, the late recognition of her haunted beauty was a posthumous embrace she never received in life. The Velvet Underground and Nico was, in the end, a triumph of authenticity over acceptance, proof that music made without compromise could outlast music made for approval. It was a slow-burning fuse, smoldering in obscurity until it finally ignited the sound of modern rock. What began in a corner of the factory with a handful of dreamers had stretched across the decades, shaping countless artists who never stopped listening to that crackling noise, that whispered poetry, that stubborn refusal to play by the rules. From the factory to forever, the Velvet Underground had written themselves into history. They did not conquer their time, they transcended it. And in doing so, they proved that sometimes the works born in failure are the very ones that change everything. So that is it for today's video. That is it for my deep dive into the Velvet Underground and Nico. This was a little bit of a different video. Usually I don't take dives that deep into the music and like music history, but I really wanted to speak about this album because it is one of my favorites. The history behind it is so wild, the story is so wild, and I wish I could travel back to 1966, 67 and see people listening to the Velvet Underground for the first time, because I cannot imagine what that must have felt like for these people. It must have been the most insane thing they ever heard, probably, and it was so far out there, but it is a record that has, over the decades, proved to be so important for modern music and for all the music that came after it. So many artists said that this is a record that inspired them to become musicians. And I do think that as an artist, that is the biggest praise you can get. So I would love to know what you think about the Velvet Underground and Nico. What's your favorite song? I have to say, it's so hard. I love Sunday Morning. There's something so dreamy and eerie about that one. But there are so many great songs. Honestly, there really are. I know a lot of people don't think that Lou Reed and Nico in particular are the best singers, but I think they both have very unique voices and they work incredibly well together. So I have to give that to Andy Warhol. While he didn't understand a lot about music, he knew that these two voices could be incredible together, and they really were. So yeah, I really hope you enjoyed the video. Let me know if there are any more records, people, things you would like me to make a video on. I would love to do it. I want to thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the video, I would love you to give it a thumbs up, maybe even share it with a friend. It supports me, it supports the channel, and it would truly mean the world. I hope you have a beautiful day. Go out, enjoy the sunshine, take yourself some time to focus on you and your mental health today, and I will catch you in the next video. Bye, dolls!